Hello, strangers. It's scary story time again. Written by Top Mind of Reddit. You can find the links as usual down below in the description. It's a fantastic story. He's got others, so please, if you like this one, go and check out the other stories that he's got. He definitely deserves the support and encouragement. This story covers some rather adult themes, so if you're under 18, please don't watch this one. Everyone knew everyone. It was a place where you could leave your front door unlocked. A nice, quiet, suburban community. That's how the neighborhoods in documentaries are described to emphasize the shattered sense of safety after a serial killer is discovered in them. That's not the case here. This neighborhood is rough. There's a slight chance you'll get mugged on your way to the grocery store, but if you go out at night, you can almost be certain it'll happen at least once. Everyone locks their doors, at least those who are lucky enough to live in an apartment where it hasn't been kicked in. The streets are crawling with drug addicts, gangs, and a bunch of folk that Reagan kicked out of institutions. To an outsider, this would seem terrifying, but each group has its own bigger picture. Drug addicts want money to feed their habit, and sometimes that means mugging people to get it. The gangs were established to generate revenue through crime and safety benefits for those that would have never received it through legal channels. And the crazies? Well, they keep to themselves for the most part. They stare and scream and mumble, and every once in a while they'll carry out an action that could be construed as a hostile attack, but they're mostly harmless. Mostly. There is, of course, that one thing that those quiet, close-knit suburbs have in common with my neighborhood. That one thing that stalks at night. That one thing that kills nearly indiscriminately for reasons that may or may not ever be understood by the victims. That one thing that is the closest you'll ever get to a real-life boogeyman. Me. That's another difference. Even the killers themselves in those documentaries are usually some polite, unassuming pillar of the community. Not me. Nobody knows my name. I'm not a youth pastor. I'm not handsome, and I'm not nice. I'm so unremarkable that the two police sketches based on witness descriptions don't look anything like each other, much less bear any resemblance to me. The monster of 134th Street is what they call me. Not the media, just people on the street. No, the news hardly covered anything that went on in this neighborhood. That's not to say that my work hadn't been featured on some afternoon cable news slot, but it was just another murder of another untouchable to them. It hardly brought any ratings. Hell, sometimes I felt like the police didn't even care. I liked to watch the moment when the bodies got discovered, if the unfortunate passerby happened to even call the police, because sometimes they don't. They could take up to 45 minutes to show up. The show was over after that. The cops were pretty boring to watch, especially since it seemed to be the same bunch that they would send here. They must have been on some kind of probationary period or something, because they all look like new boots straight out of the academy. New as they were, the shock of seeing someone's head made to look like a smashed watermelon with yellow skin wore off after the 6th or 7th time. That's what I did. I carried a hammer in my waistband, a 50-ounce ball-peen hammer, and I stalked the streets. Sometimes I already knew who it was going to be, but most of the time they found their way to me. This time, she found me. She had been walking on the edge of the park. She was at least smart enough to stay near the street under the streetlights. I was walking in the opposite direction. She was blonde. Cropped top, short skirt, fishnets. She was probably a prostitute heading home or something. I can't say I have a type. Women, men, black, white, brown, gay, straight. Those things didn't matter. I only killed those who deserved it. The ones that brought it upon themselves. The ones that laughed at me with their friends. The ones that thought they know it all. The ones who thought I was stupid. I used my hammer to show them how foolish they'd been. I used it to show them how much better I was than them. This was why Blondie had to die. Just before I passed her, she made eye contact with me and quickly pulled her phone out and began typing. The soft blue glow of her phone spotlighted the slight curl on one side of her mouth that told me all I needed to know about what she was typing. That was the smirk of someone telling her friends about how stupid I was, probably using all kinds of emojis to show how hard they're laughing at me on the inside. I would soon show her how foolish that had been. I had to be careful though. If she was a prostitute, that meant her pimp could be watching. Maybe that was a John she was texting to meet her somewhere. That was where the fun was. I watched her from the shadows. I moved into the park a little way so that I would be completely engulfed by the darkness. I hunted her, anticipated her movements, got ahead of her, waited for the right moment, waited for her to walk past me in the dark, and then the sound of such a precise strike to the temple with a hammer always turned my legs to jelly. The soft ping that sounded like a high note on a xylophone, subtly dampened by scalp and hair and layered with the quick sound of a cracking skull. It should be a musical instrument. She never knew what hit her. It happened so fast that she didn't even have a chance to scream. It wasn't over for her yet. I crouched down and continued with a deluge of facial blows. I didn't stop until I could reach my hands in and squeeze the grey matter through my fingers. "You're such a fucking fool," I told her as I squeezed. "Now look at you. Look how fucking stupid you are." I got back to my feet and picked my hammer up. Its steel head gently scraped the wet concrete. While slipping the hammer back into my wristband, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a man standing just on the dark edge of a streetlight. His face was gaunt and white as paper. His bottom lip was trembling, and he was lightly tapping the side of his head with the heel of his palm. He mumbled incoherently to himself as he stared at Blondie's lifeless body as it glistened in the dark. I approached him. He turned to look at me. I gave him a pat on the cheek, leaving a bloody handprint on the side of his face, and walked away. I circled back under the cover of darkness of the park to wait for someone to find Blondie. The crazy guy was still bumping around the area a few yards from the body. I saw a couple, a crackhead and his girlfriend, walking up the sidewalk, but stopped about 50 feet away when they noticed the man standing over the black mass. They slowly began walking backwards and eventually ran away. A few hours passed. The man had finally wandered off and the sun was coming up. Nobody else had been by for the rest of the night. I didn't want to risk being seen in the daylight so close to the body, so I left. I usually felt satiated for about a week after a kill, but being robbed of getting to watch someone find the body was like skipping a cigarette after sex. I still had the craving. I went back out again the following night. I went hunting again. The monster of 134th Street is a bit of a misnomer. I've only killed twice on that street. The name comes from the fact that I've never killed below 134th. The higher the street number, the deeper into the neighborhood you go until you hit the water. Blondie was on 136, so I decided to take 138th. It was desolate, not even any stray cats about. I'd never gone hunting the next night after making a kill. Maybe this was just how the neighborhood reacted to it, I thought. I walked 138th for 2 hours before I saw a single person. Well, I thought it was a person. I first noticed the figure was silhouetted as it walked in the darkness between streetlights. When it finally passed under the light, it gave sight to the glowing blonde hair of a woman wearing a cropped top, short skirt, and fishnets. Slowing my pace as I walked towards her, I began rubbing my eyes and wiping my face as if to physically pull the hallucination from my sight. When the blurriness subsided, she was still there, still walking towards me. Had I killed so many people that they've all begun to look the same? No. She grew closer and her facial features refuted it. She was Blondie. I began to breathe harder. My heart pounded faster as if it were trying to set a pace for my feet to match. I'd never experienced such panic. Even when I was pulverizing somebody's face with a hammer, my breathing had never become so labored. My sight was dimming. No, not dimming. It was like the contrast had been turned way up. The brightness of the light became blinding and the darkness of all the shadows became a black void. I could hear noises in the darkness. They were distant, but they seemed to be drawing nearer. Dripping sounds, heavy breathing sounds, the rhythmic sounds of something quickly dragging itself on the ground. It was impossible to see where it was coming from. In my frantic attempts to peer into the darkness, Blondie had traversed another streetlight and vanished into the black. I waited for her to re-emerge under the next light as the noises around me got louder and closer. They were now short bursts of galloping hooves just out of sight. I stopped walking before the black edge of the streetlight beam. It might as well have been a sheer drop off of the lit portion of the sidewalk. Blondie stepped into the same light from out of the darkness. She took a few steps and stopped next to me. I stared at the side of her head as she stood there looking down. She suddenly turned her head towards me. Her voice seemed to morph into something unrecognizable as human as she fell to her knees and began vomiting. She lifted her head up. Her eyes had turned black. She opened her mouth as if to continue vomiting, but nothing came out. Instead, her mouth kept opening wider and wider until the back of her head was touching her spine. I began to slowly step back as she began to make a noise like a long, deep, belch-like growl. A hooved foot forcefully protruded out of her mouth, sending me falling to my ass. With blood and bits of bone spraying out, another hoof shot out of her mouth. They began to claw themselves out of her, ripping her face apart as the creature continued to emerge. The noises around me got closer, the sources of which would pass through the margins of the streetlights, barely catching my eye. By the time I looked, there was nothing there. The rest of the girl's body seemed to turn inside of itself, the further the creature pulled itself out, eventually being completely engulfed within itself. The creature had the body of a moose that had been ripped in half, dragging the rest of its inside-out body behind it as it pulled itself along on tall, hooved legs. The creature didn't have a head. It had an anus-like sphincter that began to spew effervescent blood out onto the sidewalk. Then multiple sets of human arms came out of the hole, reaching back around and grasping at itself. Flattened and mangled bulbs of skin, hair, and twisted facial features oozed out from the bubbling blood. It stood there on its front legs, dripping with blood and thick yellow slime, the protruding arms wriggling like leeches. I sat there in complete disbelief, but I didn't have any time to contemplate the surreal nature of the events unfolding, because the creature let out a piercing screech, a shriek as it gargled on the blood spewing up from its head hole. It lunged at me. I jumped to my feet and began running into the pitch black. The sound of blood spewing onto the ground, coupled with galloping and bodies dragging, was all around me. They would run in front of me, pushing me to the ground, and if I ran the other way, I'd trip over another. They were everywhere, these creatures. I soon found myself in another blinding white circle of streetlight beam. I pulled my hammer from my waistband as I stood in the middle, spinning my head and body to try and see all 360 degrees of my small island of light. Writhing arms and crushed, undulating heads began to emerge from the darkness all around. They were closing in. I swung my hammer, striking the arms that reached for me, but they kept coming. In the blink of an eye, one of them leapt at me with such force and speed that its hooved foot punctured through my shoulder, fell to the ground. The black continued to creep in until everything was engulfed. I awoke to the sound of a beeping heart monitor. As the fuzzy details of the room slowly became sharper, they would confirm I was indeed in a hospital. A black figure stood up a few feet from the foot of the bed. As it approached me, it became clear that this black figure was a police officer. I tried to raise up in the bed, but one arm was handcuffed to the rails of the bed and the other arm was gone. "Just sit tight," the cop said, putting his hand out as if to immobilize me with the magic of law enforcement. "You're not going anywhere." My voice was hoarse and painful, no doubt from screaming. What happened to me? "We found you roaming around 138th, screaming like a loon and attacking people with a broken piece of steel pipe. Then you started attacking us and ended up taking a buckshot to the arm, hence why it isn't there anymore." I looked at him with absolute shock, but he either didn't pick up on it or he just didn't care. It didn't matter because I would soon have more questions when another patient would be wheeled into the secured section of the hospital. It was an older man. An older man with a bloody handprint on his face. He seemed to be asleep. "Look at that, you get to share your room with a celebrity," the cop said with a chuckle. "Celebrity?" I asked. "Yep, that there's the infamous monster of 134th Street. I looked back at the old man as the cop's words continued behind my own thoughts. "We caught him yesterday, but he spent all night in a cell screaming at the top of his lungs about how demons with arms coming out of their faces were creeping in on him from the dark corners of the jail. They found him unresponsive about an hour ago, so they brought him here to get him checked out." I stared at the man for what seemed to be eternity. The edges of my sight began to fade into dark grey as I tunneled into the handprint on the man's face. His lip began to tremble and he started to stir. He opened his eyes to the ceiling and scanned it for a second before slowly letting his sight fall on me. His eyes widened and he took trembling gasps of air as he tried in vain to jump out of the bed to get away. He became hysterical, screaming and jerking his hand through the handcuff. The cop rushed over to physically restrain him, but the man's fear was stronger. The skin on his arm began to bunch up around the cuffs as if he was slipping off a glove. The man's shrieks began to form words. He was screaming for me to get away and pleading with the officer to shoot the demon in the bed next to his. The man was restrained and sedated. Eventually his shrieks subsided to whimpers in his sleep. Drowsy from painkillers, I also fell asleep. I would wake up sporadically for only minutes at a time for the next few days, but during one of these waking intervals I overheard the doctors clearing me for discharge. I wouldn't be released, of course. I would be discharged to the jail to await trial. I was shown to my cell earlier today. I've spent the last several hours ruminating about the events of the past week. The monsters, the crazy old man, Blondie. Had I hallucinated everything? Had I killed anyone? I concluded that it couldn't have been a hallucination because that crazy man, he thought I was one of them, one of those monsters. I'm writing this now because I have a feeling that I'd receive the answers to these questions and others that I'd rather not know the answers to. I have this feeling because as the hours count down and the sun falls behind the brick, glass and steel monoliths that surround the jail, the lights turn bright white while the darkness becomes a black void. I know it's just a matter of time before I begin to hear the creatures stalking me from the dark that creeps in from beyond the bars of my cell, the dark that's so thick that it has physical presence that I can touch, and it can touch me. Even as I write this, I feel the darkness slide up my spine and wrap around my neck. Yes, tonight I will have all the answers. There is one last piece to this story. You can find it tucked away in the comments below. That's going to do it for today, strangers. Thank you again for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing or leaving a thumbs up, maybe even a comment down below. I do try to get back to everybody that comments. And a reminder to go check out Top Mind of Reddit's other stories. You can find them in the links below. You guys stay creepy. See you next time on Beyond Strange.